Who would win between Nobara and Todo? Shout out to Frogs for the question. We're going to handle this matchup and a few other matchups and questions from you guys. But to kick it off right here, I hate to say it, but this one's pretty one-sided in my opinion, and I got to give it to our boy Todo. You know, I'm not speaking about like hypothetical ceiling or potential. If we just take the versions of these characters that we are with in the show, Todo's just on another level, right? He's a grade 1 sorcerer. He handled a bunch of curses on the Night Parade of 100 Demons and didn't even have to use his curse technique except for when he was facing a special grade curse. And again, no slouch, no disrespect over here with Nobara, but she's just not on that level yet. So, you know, her curse technique's great, but especially against Toto's, he could just like swap out anytime she like got a piece of him to potentially use her voodoo on, you know, if she could even get her hands on something. I think he's just going to be too quick, and his curse technique is just a bad matchup for hers in general. All right, next up, we've got several matchups from Aang, the first of which is Heian Form Sukuna at 20 fingers worth of strength, but without his innate technique or his domain expansion, versus Shibuya Sukuna, aka 15 fingers of strength, in Yuji's body, but with his technique and domain expansion. Now, there is the caveat that Heian Form Sukuna will still have access to domain amplification, Hollow Wicker Basket, and RCT. So, who would win? And I think this is kind of a tough matchup to compare, but I do agree with you. I think Heian Form Sukuna takes this ultimately just because the extra stats, not to mention the extra arms, are going to make the difference, I think. Because, yeah, he doesn't have the technique, but he doesn't really need it. Because if, you know, normal Sukuna uses the domain expansion, he can just Hollow Wicker Basket or maybe even just move, like get out of dodge in time. But even the Hollow Wicker Basket will be enough, I think, especially with the extra arms. So I think, you know, at 20 fingers worth of strength, he's just going to be so much stronger and faster that he'll be able to take 15 fingers Sukuna down. And the fact that he doesn't have anything else doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, they've got the same brain, right? So they're going to have the same battle IQ. 15 fingers Sukuna won't be able to like outsmart him really or pull anything out of his bag of tricks that 20 fingers Sukuna isn't going to be familiar with, because they're the same person, right? So Heian Form Sukuna. Next up, we've got a matchup between Todo and either Naobito or Naoya, with the idea being Boogie Woogie versus Projection Sorcery. And, you know, I just spoke about Todo in the first matchup, and I'm going to have to go with him again because, one, Todo's no slouch just in general, right? I think he kind of beats both of those dudes in just pure physical stats, if you will, and probably has a higher IQ as well. I mean, almost definitely. So battle IQ wins in that column. And then finally, I think Boogie Woogie is just a terrible matchup for Projection Sorcery. Yeah, Naobito or Naoya might be able to like be faster than Todo whilst their technique is going. And so I could see them, you know, getting a few licks in on Todo, activating the technique on Todo himself, like sure, but in the vast majority of the fight, I think his swapping is going to interfere with them much more than any benefit they're going to get from that. So yeah, because for those of you that don't know, Projection Sorcery, you have to follow the movements that you set out. So if Todo swaps them, or he just swaps debris or random other things like in the room where they're fighting that is going to interfere with their movement path, they're just screwed. For our third matchup down here, we've got Miguel with his Black Rope taking on the Disaster Curse Gauntlet, but with the caveat that the Disaster Curses will not have their domains. So this is tough, man, because Miguel is strong. Quote from Gege right there. And we know he's just kind of built different in general, just like Todo. So we give him the Black Rope. They don't have their domains. I think Miguel takes Dagon pretty easily. I think he gets Hanami. Now, with Jogo and Mahito, it's tough because it's how effective is that rope going to be against their technique specifically? Like, we know it interfered with the Limitless, but like if Jogo's, you know, 3 city blocks away and he just pours fire and destroys a whole portion of the city, what's the rope really going to do at that point? Now, maybe Miguel is fast enough to just not get hit by any of Jogo's attacks, just like we saw with Sukuna, but I'm not convinced. And then similarly with Mahito, I just don't know how the rope would really interfere with Idol Transfiguration or not. In terms of damaging him, you know? I don't know. It's tough. I don't feel confident saying he could get past Jogo or Mahito, so I guess we'll say he stops at Hanami, Dagon and Hanami. Now, for these final two matchups from Aang, I do have to get into some spoilers, so for my anime onlys, you might want to back on out at this point. But our next one is Current Maki with or without the Soul Split Katana versus Yorozu. Now, this one would be a really good matchup, I think, but I ultimately think Maki takes it, especially if she's got something like the Soul Split Katana. Now, I think even without it, Maki is going to be powerful enough with, any type of curse tool or weapon to like get through whatever armor Yorozu might make with her curse technique, but especially if she's got the Soul Split Katana, she's going to get the job done, in my opinion. Now, that's not to say that Yorozu couldn't cause Maki some trouble, especially if we're going to throw, something like the Perfect Sphere out there, but I think Maki could just get the job done before we reach that point. And or since we don't fully know how the Perfect Sphere like works, considering Sukuna was just kind of like letting it happen so that Maharaga could deal with it, I'm not convinced that Yorozu would actually be able to like hit Maki with it, if that makes sense. Maybe she could, and in which case I think Maki just deals with her before that happens though. But I would love to see this matchup, especially the psychological element that you're talking about of how would Maki react to seeing Yorozu using the same curse technique as Mai. I think that would be an interesting element to explore, like thematically and narratively, but I do think Maki would win. And then our final matchup here is Vengeful Spirit Naoya versus the Disaster Curse Gauntlet, but domains included. Now this is tough because it's so hard to quantify domain refinement, right? Like I could certainly tell you who feels stronger in the story, but does that necessarily mean their domain's going to be more refined? I don't know. And mostly we're talking about Naoya here because, he got this power jump by becoming the Cursed Spirit. He got the domain expansion, but it's like all brand new to him, right? So does that mean it's not that refined? I don't know. So I'll say that it feels like he would pretty easily get by Hanami and Dagon. I guess they're just fodder. Jogo feels a bit tougher. We know that even Naobito was said to be faster than Jogo. So Vengeful Naoya is going to be so much faster than all of the disaster curses. So I think he could take Jogo out if there's no domains involved, and he might even take him out with the domain, but I just feel like if anyone, Jogo's domain might be more refined than Naoya's. But would probably give the edge to Naoya. And then Mahito, I think in the domain, Naoya wins, because I think that domain is going to be enough to take out Mahito, even with his idle transfiguration hacks, if you will. But without the domain, I'm not sure Naoya is going to be able to do enough to Mahito. He could win the battle of attrition, which I just put out a video about Gojo versus Mahito, if you don't know what I mean by that. But, I think if Mahito can get his domain off, or can get enough idle transfigurations off to like morph Naoya's body and take away his speed, as it were, then I think Mahito could win. So I again would give the edge to Naoya, but I do think it's possible for Mahito and Jogo to beat him. So for what that's worth. And then for Aang's final part of his sponsored question here, he wanted me to react to kind of an ending theory, if you will. Now, I couldn't get all of it because it was too much for one screenshot, but for those that want to pause and, get a deeper reading of what he said here, feel free. But essentially, he's saying that Yuji will be the one to defeat Sukuna, and that the story will not end with Sukuna winning. So I've briefly spoken about the potential of like an evil ending of JJK where Sukuna does win. And I personally think that would be really cool and like a legendary way for JJK to end. But I don't think that's how JJK is going to end. So I agree with you. I think Sukuna will be defeated. And I agree with you that it's going to be Yuji. Like, this is Yuji's story, right? Now, Yuji might even not make it through the end of this story, but I do think he will be responsible for Sukuna's ultimate downfall. I think Yuji will be the one to teach Sukuna about love. So, you mentioned in this theory that, the strength of Yuji's ideals are the only ones that stack up to Sukuna. Right there with you. I think that is the story that Gege has been directing us toward. The only thing I'll push back on you here is where you say why Gojo coming back would really hurt the story. As you guys know, I'm a card-carrying member of the Gojo Copium Club. I do think he's coming back. But something I've said, I don't know, Aang, if you personally have seen these videos, is that I don't think Gojo's coming back to be the savior, to save the day, to go Super Saiyan. I think it's just we don't have to get into it here, but I think Gojo's coming back. But also, I think Yuji will be the one to defeat Sukuna. So we pretty much agree. And then finally, to round out this video, we got this question from Zachariah that asks, JJK versus Yu Yu Hakusho versus Hunter x Hunter, which is the best. So I just gotta say to begin with that, Togashi, who wrote Hunter x Hunter and Yu Yu Hakusho, is one of, if not the biggest influences to Gege, to JJK. There are so many references and influences there. But my personal preference, I'd have to go with JJK. Might be some recency bias, though.